This show has been brought to you by Smith's Detection and the National Air Traffic Controllers Association.
My voice is the voice that guides you home safely each and every day.
24 hours a day, 365 days a year.
I am the voice of the safest and most efficient airspace in the world.
I have to be 100% of the time.
I am.
I am.
I am.
I am a professional air traffic controller.
Earlier today, AAAE President and CEO Todd Hauptli had the chance to go one-on-one with Senator John Thune of South Dakota. Senator Thune, in addition to being chairman of the Commerce Committee, which has jurisdiction over FAA reauthorization and important pieces of the infrastructure package, also serves as a senior member of the Tax Writing Committee in the Senate Finance Committee. Todd and Senator Thune discussed the upcoming FAA reauthorization process, prospects for an infrastructure package, public-private financing, and the path forward through a crowded Senate agenda. Here's a look.
Chairman Thune, thank you very much for the chance for us to be here with you again in your office. We appreciate the time together.
Great to be with you. Thanks, Todd.
Recently, the President of the United States addressed Congress. I'm going to read this to you. And he said, "To launch our national rebuilding, I will be asking the Congress to approve legislation that produces $1 trillion in investment in the infrastructure of the United States, financed through both public and private capital, creating millions of new jobs." Now, you're the chairman of the committee in the Senate that's going to deal with the public piece of that, public financing of that through the federal government. You're also a senior member of the Finance Committee that's going to have sway over the private capital part of that equation. How do you see this infrastructure plan going forward?
Well, I think we'll have a better idea about that when the administration comes up with a specific, definitive plan. They did do some. There was some discussion about it during the course of the campaign. There were some proposals out there, $1 trillion, as you mentioned, financed primarily by P3s or public-private partnerships. We're all for those, and we hope that you can leverage some public money and get a lot of private investment. There are areas in the country where that doesn't work very well, South Dakota being among those. And I think there's going to have to be probably a different approach used to funding infrastructure in states where you don't have the population base to generate the kinds of returns that investors are going to be looking for in a P3 type framework. So we're open to working with the new administration. We look forward to hearing from them more about their proposal. We hope that it includes everything. We hope that it includes planes, trains, automobiles, and broadband, because I think those are all things that are important to our infrastructure. But anything that we can do that facilitates the people getting to and from their destinations, moving freight across this country in a more efficient, cost-effective way is good for our economy. It makes us more competitive globally. And so I'm a big believer in infrastructure, and obviously I want to be able to figure out a good way to do it, a good way to pay for it, be fiscally responsible in how we do it. But I hope there's something out there that we can work together on that will really grow our economy and create better paying jobs in this country and lead to easier transportation, more convenience for travelers, higher levels of safety, and promote economic growth.
So the executive branch proposes.
Yes.
And the legislative branch disposes. So at some point, where the rubber meets the road is in your committee.
Right.
The president can propose something, but at the end of the day, Congress is going to be the one taking the action. So how long do you give the administration to come up with something specific, and when does Congress kick into gear on an infrastructure bill?
We have, as you know, a deadline on FAA reauthorization that's the end of September. I'm hoping, as soon as the administration sort of deals with the health care issue, Obamacare repeal and replacement, which I think that's underway right now. Hopefully that starts to take shape and maybe get wrapped up in the not too distant future. And then they'll be able to move to the next step. Now, there's been some discussion about tax reform and whether or not infrastructure might hitch a ride on a tax reform bill. That could be a vehicle for that. But our committee obviously is prepared to engage. We've had some preliminary conversations. As I mentioned, we think that there's an opening here to do something meaningful on infrastructure. And I'm hoping that there will be the political consensus behind an approach that enables us to put, to really invest in our infrastructure in this country in places where you have the population base and you can do public-private partnerships, and also in rural areas where that's probably not going to be as easy. And it's going to take some different thinking. And we're having some of those preliminary conversations and discussions, and we hope that that continues, and we hope that we'll see something definitive from the administration soon. But we do have certain deadlines we have to comply with too, one of which is the expiration of the current FAA authorization.
I'll get into that in just a second, but one of the things that's interesting about this infrastructure debate, unlike a number of other public policy issues in Washington at the moment, is there's universal agreement among Republicans and Democrats that infrastructure needs greater investment in this country. It's not a whether we should, it's a how-to conversation. And so Democrats have put forward a proposal that has a lot of federal spending in it. The administration has put forward a proposal, has talked about a lot of private investment, and it seems like there's going to have to be some meeting in the middle on that. Yeah.
There is, I think, and then, that's always a legislative process. It's going to take 60 votes in the Senate to do anything consequential. There are a few things we can do at 51 through reconciliation, but a lot of what we're talking about probably is going to take 60 votes, which means you're going to have some Democrats on board, which means you're probably going to have to, in the end, incorporate some of their ideas and their thinking in whatever bill ultimately emerges. We work well on our committee with our Democrat counterparts. We've produced a lot of bipartisan legislation, and I expect, as it has been in the past, that infrastructure will be an issue where you do find bipartisan support. I've been a member of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee in the House of Representatives, and I've been now for a long time in the Senate on the Commerce Committee, and it always seems that that's one of those issues that kind of brings people together, and I would hope that would be the case. Of course, we have to figure out, again, we've got budgetary constraints we have to deal with, figure out how to do things in new and innovative and creative ways. But there's always going to be a certain amount of public investment if we're going to have these types of things. And people in this country have to understand, if they want good infrastructure, we have to pay for it. And in the past few years, we've been borrowing from the general fund because we haven't been willing to make that necessary commitment. And at some point, we have to come to the hard realization that these things are important, these are priorities. Our economy, if it's growing at a faster rate, creating better paying jobs, lifting wages in this country is a good thing. And in order to make that happen, we've got to have the infrastructure to support it. And that's going to require, in some cases, people being willing to pay for that.
You referenced FAA reauthorization and a deadline that's coming up. As you and I sit here today while we tape this, 205 days is on the clock in terms of when that expires. What's your plan for Senate committee consideration and Senate floor consideration of an FAA bill this year?
Well, we've got, as you said, 6 or 7 months to deal with. It would be great if we could deal with some of the FAA issues in infrastructure bill if we get something coming from the administration. If we don't, obviously we've got to proceed, and there are a lot of issues that probably wouldn't be addressed in infrastructure bill. We've got the drone issue, which is something that's going to require a lot of ongoing attention because of the new technologies and the development of that industry. And of course we've got the ongoing safety considerations. We did a lot of things in the last FAA bill with TSA to try and make moving through our airports safer, looking for ways that we can improve public safety. We'll be looking at those things again too, and obviously, we want to make sure that we're getting as far along the path as we can toward implementation of next-gen technologies. And there are a lot of issues attendant to that discussion that will come into play for the debate. We're in the process right now of thinking through what that might look like. The House, of course, has some other ideas, different ideas about how to approach the FAA reauthorization to include air traffic control reform, and we're listening, we're open to that, but we've got to work within the constraints that we have on our committee and in the Senate to move a bill forward, knowing that it's going to take 60 votes to pass it, and that process is already underway. We'll probably have a series of hearings and ultimately mark a bill up. But it'd be nice to get ahead of that deadline instead of getting to September 30th and what usually happens, passing short-term extensions. I don't like short-term extensions, and we want to avoid those if we can, and sometimes it's unavoidable, but I think we need to start our work now.
The last Congress had this debate about FAA reauthorization. The House introduced a bill and reported it through committee, but it didn't go any further than that. You alluded to changes to air traffic control in that bill. The Senate did not include that. Has anything changed much since last time around, or are we going to see a rerun of the same debate with most of the airlines, but not all the airlines, on one side of the air traffic control debate, and most of the general aviation groups and rural interests on the other side of that debate? Has anything changed?
That appears to be the way it's stacking up again. I think the players, there's nothing fundamentally changed in terms of kind of how people are at least initially positioning on that issue. The one exception being there's a new administration. And I don't know exactly where they're going to come down on this. But I know that the House probably, to pass their bill, is going to have to change some votes. Obviously, they were able to get it, as you said, through the committee in the last Congress, but they couldn't move a bill across the House floor. So, you know, unless that changes, I suspect that we're probably going to be writing a bill along the lines of what we saw the last time, hopefully for a longer duration. But we'll see. I mean, if they are able to pop a bill loose over there that has some significant changes in terms of you know, the management governance of our air traffic control system in this country, we will certainly take a hard look at that. But right now, on our committee at least, I would say there are, as you pointed out, people who have strong general aviation constituencies who have continue to have concerns about that approach.
There is an issue that seems to have pretty widespread support in the administration and in the House and the Senate among at least Republicans, and that is a stronger regulatory relief agenda, looking at various regulations or interpretations of law that agencies have taken over the years and maybe adjusting those, rolling some of those back, making modifications. Do you see regulatory relief as a component in the committee's agenda going forward?
Well, I certainly hope that that is a part of anything that we consider. We're looking at ways, how do we remove barriers and obstacles to builds, to projects, those sorts of things. And I think that there are lots of areas in which regulations impact the economy, and it's across all sectors of the economy, and aviation is no exception. So I welcome what the administration is doing in terms of looking at the regulatory burden that's out there today, what of those regulations are necessary for public health and safety, and what regulations in many cases are there for regulation's sake. I frankly think it's important that these regulations be, you know, the President's talked about if for every new one's created, you got to get rid of 2 old ones. Now, maybe that's not the rule of thumb that's used, but in some way, you have to have a process that enables you to review whether these are relevant and whether or not they're actually accomplishing an objective that does relate to health and safety, or are these just regulations that are driving up the cost of doing business in this country? So that's a good process. We welcome that process. We're going to be looking in every bill that we move through our committee at ways to lessen that regulatory burden, that hurdle, and make it easier to get projects built, make it easier for people to invest in infrastructure in this country, and on some levels, just unleash the what I think is just like a huge impediment and barrier right now that we're seeing to a more robust, expansive growth in our economy. We got to get growth back up in our economy, and when our economy is growing at 3 to 4%, it means that people are working, people are investing, people are paying taxes, government revenues go up. Makes it all the fiscal issues in the country look a lot smaller by comparison, and it certainly means that the standard of living of Americans is going up as well because wages come with it.
I want to circle back to something that you talked about at the top of the interview, P3s, and the principal advantage, it seems, of using a P3 approach is that you get to leverage this private capital when you're building infrastructure. But you also noted that in rural parts of the country that it's an uneven applicability or utilization for P3s. The passenger facility charge program that airports utilize and have been trying to increase allows for that same kind of leverage that a P3 would. You can use those locally imposed PFCs to pay debt service on bonds and to leverage the funding. Airports talk about that being, we should make that a local decision, get the federal government out of that whole business of rent control, if you will, between a landlord and a tenant, and have that be a local decision, push that down to the local units of government closest to the people. Philosophically, does that approach make sense?
It does, and I'm a big believer in allowing people at the local level to make a lot of those decisions, and if they decide they want to levy some sort of tax or create a revenue stream or source to do things that are important, that's where it ought to be done. And so the whole discussion about PFCs in the last FAA reauthorization, and it did come up. There wasn't the consensus to do anything there at the time. That issue, I think, gets revisited every time we have an FAA reauthorization, and I'm sure it will this time as well. Because there's a high level of interest across our country at airports and making investments that will benefit customers. And the customers, those who use those facilities, are the people that ought to finance it. It's the same way that we approach roads and bridges in this country as a user fee approach to that. And so, we'll see where the votes are, where the consensus lies on that issue. Obviously, AIP funding, the Airport Improvement Program, is something too that helps airports. We tried to plus up funding in the last FAA bill, and the bill that emerged from the Senate had a $400 million increase in AIP funding, which ultimately wasn't in the final bill. But we have to look at ways that we can ensure that our airports are making the investments that not only make air travel safer, but also hopefully get away from the congestion, the backlogs, and make it more convenient and more usable for the flying public. So how PFCs folds into that debate remains to be seen, but I suspect that'll be discussion that'll be held for sure.
Would it be too much to say you have an open mind on that issue?
Well, I think I try and keep an open mind going into a debate on any of these major issues, and particularly with regard to infrastructure in this country, because I know in some way these things have to be paid for. And I do appreciate the concept of having people locally deciding these issues. I think in terms of the tone of the discussion in the last FAA reauthorization, it always comes down to, well, it's going to be a tax increase out of Washington, D.C. And that's where I think people have to, people have to be, I guess, paying enough attention to this discussion to understand that this really is, in many ways, it's a local decision. And I think that's the point that oftentimes gets lost, and I think that's something that in the discussion about that issue will have to be really reinforced, and people get that.
Chairman Thune, thank you for the time. We appreciate that. We appreciate your leadership on the committee. We'll look forward to working with you and your colleagues on getting another FAA bill done and an infrastructure bill.
We appreciate that. We'll look forward to working with you. Thanks, Todd. All right.